The year was 196 AC, and the realm had just finished drowning in blood. On the fields of red grass, where the grass itself seemed to weep red with the blood of 20,000 men, the first Blackfyre rebellion had ended not with songs of glory, but with the screams of the dying and the silence of the dead. Demon Blackfyre, the warrior who would be king, lay cold beneath the ground alongside his twin sons. The rebellion that had promised to restore true Targaryen rule, or so its followers claimed, had shattered against the iron will of Daeron the Good and the cunning of Brynden Rivers, the man they called Blood Raven. For most of Westeros, the war's end meant a return to peace, however uneasy. Fields could be planted again, trade could resume, the living could bury their dead and try to forget the madness that had set brother against brother, lord against lord, dragon against dragon. But for those who had staked everything on Daemon's cause, there would be no forgetting. There would be no peace. There would be only exile. Among those who refused to bend the knee stood Igor Rivers, called Bittersteel, bastard son of Aegon the Unworthy, half-brother to both King Daeron and the fallen demon. He had fought at Redgrass Field and watched his cause die in mud and blood. Where other lords might have sought pardons, where other knights might have returned home to beg forgiveness, Bittersteel made a different choice. He gathered what remained of the rebellion's most devoted, knights who had lost their lands, lords whose keeps had been seized, squires whose fathers hung from gallows, common soldiers who found themselves outlawed in the only home they had ever known. And he led them east, across the narrow sea, into exile. They numbered in the thousands at first, this army of the dispossessed. They carried with them what they could salvage, weapons, armor, horses, the clothes on their backs. Some brought their families, others left wives and children behind, promising to return when the time was right, when another chance came, when the usurper's line could be overthrown and true justice restored to Westeros. These promises would echo across generations, growing fainter with each passing year, but never quite dying. Bittersteel was not a man given to grand speeches or empty promises. Where his half-brother Daemon had been charismatic and golden, inspiring loyalty through his very presence, Igor Rivers was something harder, something colder. He was a warrior of brutal efficiency, a commander who understood that wars were won not through valor alone, but through discipline, through will, through the simple refusal to break no matter how terrible the odds. His face bore the marks of his choices. A broad, flat nose broken in battle, eyes that seemed perpetually narrowed against some harsh wind, a mouth set in a line that suggested he had forgotten how to smile, if he ever knew. It was this man, this exile with nothing left to lose, who would forge the most feared and respected sellsword company in the known world. Essos offered little welcome to Westerosi refugees, even those who came with swords and armor. The free cities had their own wars, their own allegiances, their own sellsword companies already established. The disputed lands between Myre, Lys, and Tyrosh had been soaked in blood for generations, providing endless work for those willing to kill for coin, but the competition was fierce. Companies like the Second Sons and the Windblown had reputations stretching back decades. Why should any magister or archon trust a company of defeated rebels, men who had failed to win their own war? Bittersteel understood this doubt. He also understood that reputation, once lost, could be rebuilt through one thing alone: results. The early years were brutal. The Golden Company, for that is what Bittersteel named them, a bitter jest at the golden dragon sigil his half-brother Daemon had borne, took contracts others refused. They fought in the worst weather, against the longest odds, for the hardest masters. They did not negotiate terms. They did not break contracts, no matter the cost. When a contract was signed, it was fulfilled, even if it meant fighting to the last man. Other sellsword companies would abandon their employers if the gold stopped flowing, or if the enemy proved stronger than expected. Such practical betrayals were simply the way of things in Essos, where loyalty was a commodity bought and sold like silk or spices. The Second Sons had broken contract a dozen times, fighting for whichever side offered more coin. The Windblown earned their name by changing allegiances with every shift in fortune. The Golden Company never broke a contract. Not once. This was not honor in the Westerosi sense, not the chivalric code that demanded knights protect the weak and fight only for just causes. This was something colder, something born from the humiliation of defeat and exile. Every contract fulfilled was a demonstration that they were better than the lords who had cast them out. Every victory was proof that Daeron the Good had been wrong to oppose them, that Bloodraven had been wrong to defeat them, that Westeros itself had been wrong to choose the Red Dragon over the Black. They were making a point, one battle at a time, one contract at a time. They were saying, "We do not break, we do not bend. Our word is as good as gold." The motto became their oath, sworn by every man who joined their ranks. It became more than mere words. It became identity, purpose, the very foundation of what the Golden Company meant. In a world where betrayal was expected and loyalty could be purchased by the highest bidder, the Golden Company offered something different: absolute reliability. When they agreed to fight, they fought. When they agreed to hold a position, they held it. When they swore to defend a city, they defended it even unto death. This reliability came at a cost measured in blood and graves. In the early years, entire companies of Golden Company soldiers died fulfilling contracts that other sellswords would have abandoned. They held gates that should have been surrendered. They fought battles that could not be won, but had been agreed to. They buried their dead in foreign soil and continued marching, because to break contract would be to admit defeat, and they had already tasted defeat once. They would not taste it again. Slowly, grudgingly, the free cities began to notice. The Golden Company was not like other sellswords. They were better trained, better disciplined, better equipped. More importantly, they could be trusted, not out of virtue, but out of sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. When a magister hired the Golden Company, he knew exactly what he was getting. There would be no sudden demands for more gold, no midnight betrayals, no sudden changes of allegiance. The contract would be fulfilled, or the Golden Company would cease to exist trying. This reputation for absolute reliability made them valuable. Within a decade of their founding, they commanded higher fees than any other company. Within 2 decades, they were the first choice of anyone in Essos who needed soldiers and could afford the best. Magisters of Myr, Archons of Tirosh, merchant princes of Lys, all came to the Golden Company when the stakes were highest and failure could not be tolerated, but Bittersteel never let them forget why they had come to Essos in the first place. Every man who joined the Golden Company swore not just to uphold contracts but to remember Westeros. They swore to remember the defeat at Redgrass Field. They swore to remember the lords who had cast them out. They swore to remember that they were exiles, not mercenaries, and that every coin they earned, every victory they won, every reputation they built was in service to a single, distant goal: return. The company's other motto captured this perfectly: beneath the gold, the bitter steel. The gold was their reputation, their contracts, their success in Essos, but beneath it all lay the bitter steel of Aegor River's unrelenting hatred for those who had defeated him, and his unshakable determination that one day, somehow, some way, the exiles would return to Westeros and reclaim what had been taken from them. This was not merely Bittersteel's personal obsession, though it certainly began that way. He deliberately cultivated in his soldiers, ensuring that the dream of return was passed from one generation to the next like a sacred flame. The officers of the Golden Company were chosen not just for their martial skill, but for their dedication to the cause. Songs were sung around campfires about Westeros, about the Crownlands and the Reach, about the great castles and ancient houses they would reclaim. Children born in Essos to Golden Company soldiers were raised on stories of a homeland they had never seen, taught to think of themselves not as Essosi or as simple sellswords, but as Westerosi, in exile, as soldiers waiting for their chance to go home. It was a brilliant strategy for maintaining cohesion and loyalty, but it came with a price. The Golden Company became a company frozen in time, unable to fully embrace the present because they were forever looking backward to a lost past and forward to a promised future. They fought in Essos, they bled in Essos, they died in Essos, but they never truly belonged to Essos. They were ghosts haunting the wrong continent, waiting for a door to open that might never open at all. And Bittersteel? He aged into those years like iron left too long in the rain, hard, cold, slowly rusting, but never quite breaking. He commanded the Golden Company for decades, long enough to become a legend not just among his own men but throughout Essos. Stories were told of his ferocity in battle, of his cold pragmatism in negotiation, of his absolute refusal to ever speak of surrender or defeat. He had lost an eye in one of the company's early contracts, and thereafter wore a jeweled eye socket that men said could see through lies. He had lost fingers to frostbite during a winter campaign in the disputed lands, but never complained of the cold again. His body accumulated scars like other men accumulated coins, each one a testament to his refusal to break, but for all his strength, for all his success in building the Golden Company into the most formidable fighting force in Essos, Bittersteel was haunted by the fundamental truth of his situation. He was getting older, and he was still in exile. The years passed, one after another, and Westeros remained across the narrow sea, as distant and unreachable as ever. Daeron the Good ruled in King's Landing, and then his son Aerys ruled, and still the exiles waited in Essos, fighting other people's wars, growing richer and more famous but never coming any closer to home. The bitterness in Bittersteel's heart, already deep, deepened further. He had given up everything for Demon Blackfyre's cause, and Demon was dead. He had fled Westeros to preserve what remained of the rebellion, and those who fled with him were dying of age and disease in foreign lands, never seeing home again. He had built the finest fighting company in the known world, and it earned gold defending cities he did not care about in wars that meant nothing to him. But Bittersteel was nothing if not patient. He understood what many of his followers did not, that one defeat did not end the game, that history was long and memories were short, that thrones were always more fragile than they appeared. Demon Blackfyre was dead, but Demon had fathered sons before Redgrass Field, and those sons had been smuggled to safety across the narrow sea. The Blackfyre line continued. The cause continued. And as long as there was a Blackfyre with a claim to the Iron Throne, there was hope of return. Not in his lifetime, perhaps. Bittersteel was pragmatic enough to recognize that he might die in exile, that he might never see the shores of Westeros again. But the Golden Company would endure. The oath would endure. The dream would endure. And one day, perhaps not in his lifetime, but in the lifetime of his successors, the exiles would board their ships and sail west, and they would take back what had been stolen from them. This was the legacy Bittersteel built in those first decades of exile. Not just a sellsword company, but a weapon forged specifically to reclaim the Iron Throne. Every contract they fulfilled, every reputation they built, every coin they saved was ultimately in service to that single goal. They were not mercenaries content to wander Essos forever, growing fat on gold and glory. They were exiles, and they never let themselves forget it. The Golden Company would wait. It would grow stronger. It would prepare. And when the moment came, when Westeros was weak, when the Targaryens faltered, when opportunity presented itself, they would be ready. They had failed once. They would not fail again. Their word was good as gold, and they had given their word to return. But gold and reputation alone would not reclaim the Iron Throne. For that, they would need another Blackfyre, another chance, another war. And in the years to come, they would get their chances. Again and again, they would sail for Westeros, carrying the dreams of exile and the weight of bitter steel. Again and again, they would fail. But that story, the story of how the Golden Company's dream was tested, broken, and somehow never quite extinguished, that story was only beginning. The decades passed slowly in Essos, each year bleeding into the next with the same rhythm of contracts and campaigns, the same careful accumulation of gold and reputation, the same whispered promises around campfires that one day, somehow, they would return home. For the soldiers of the Golden Company, patience was not a virtue, but a necessity. They could not force their way back to Westeros through will alone. They needed opportunity, and opportunity required waiting. But Aegor Rivers, bitter steel, was not a man content to wait forever. By the early years of the 3rd century after Aegon's conquest, a new generation had risen within the Golden Company. Some were sons of the original exiles, born in Essos, but raised on stories of a homeland they had never seen. Others were Westerosi who had fled to Essos for their own reasons, younger sons with no inheritance, knights who had chosen the wrong side in some local dispute, adventurers seeking fortune in foreign wars. All of them swore the oath, all of them took the gold, and all of them learned to dream of Westeros the way a drowning man dreams of air, and in Essos, hidden away from the eyes of the Iron Throne and protected by the Golden Company's blades, the Blackfyre line had continued. Demon Blackfyre's sons, smuggled across the narrow sea after their father's death at Redgrass Field, had grown to manhood in exile. The eldest, Demon II, had inherited not just his father's name, but his father's claim to the Iron Throne. He was a young man now, trained in arms by the finest warriors of the Golden Company, educated in the histories and politics of Westeros by men who remembered the realm firsthand, and raised with the absolute certainty that the Iron Throne was his by right. Bitter Steel looked at this young man, this second demon, this new hope for the cause, and saw a possibility. The boy was not his brother. He lacked Demon I's almost supernatural charisma, that golden presence that had made men willing to die for a smile and a word of praise. But the second demon was competent, well-trained, and most importantly, he carried the Blackfyre name. In Westeros, names mattered, blood mattered, and there were still lords across the narrow sea who remembered the first rebellion, who had secretly supported Demon I, who might be convinced to rise again if given the right opportunity. The question was not whether to make the attempt. Bitter Steel had always known they would try again. The question was when and how, and with what support they could muster in a realm that had supposedly made peace with itself after the devastation of the first rebellion. The answer came from an unexpected source, whispers of discontent with the rule of Aerys the Sour Targaryen. King Aerys was not a tyrant in the mold of his grandfather Aegon the Unworthy, nor was he particularly cruel or incompetent. His great sin, in the eyes of many lords, was simpler and perhaps more damning. He was bookish, pious, and uninterested in ruling. He left the actual governance of the realm to his hand, Brynden Rivers, Blood Raven, the albino sorcerer who had defeated them at Redgrass Field, the man who had orchestrated the judicial murder of Demon I's sons who had been foolish enough to remain in Westeros. Blood Raven ruled with an iron fist disguised in a velvet glove, and his network of spies and informers reached into every corner of the 7 kingdoms. But no regime, however well organized, is without its enemies. There were lords who chafed under Blood Raven's watchful eye, who resented his bastard blood and his dark reputation, who longed for the days when the hand of the king was a great lord of ancient lineage rather than the son of a bracken whore. There were knights who still sang quietly of Daemon Blackfyre's valor, who had fought for the Black Dragon at Redgrass Field and been pardoned but never quite forgiven. There were small folk who remembered the prosperity under Daeron the Good and compared it unfavorably to the harder years under Aerys the Bookish. And there were ambitious men, always, who saw opportunities in chaos and who might be convinced that supporting a second Blackfyre rebellion could elevate them to positions of power if it succeeded. Bitter Steel sent agents into Westeros, not armies, not yet, but subtle men who could move through the realm without drawing Bloodraven's attention. They carried messages to old allies, to lords whose fathers or grandfathers had supported the first rebellion, to anyone who might be convinced that the time had come to try again. They whispered that Demon II had reached manhood, that the Golden Company stood ready to support him, that this time things would be different, that this time they would succeed where the first rebellion had failed. Some of these agents were captured by Blood Raven's spies. Some were executed quietly, their bodies disappearing into the dungeons beneath the Red Keep or thrown into the Bay of Crabs. But others succeeded in making contact, in planting seeds of rebellion, in building the network that would be necessary for a second rising. The year was 211 AC, 15 years after Redgrass Field, and the exiles prepared to return home. The plan, such as it was, relied on stealth and surprise rather than open warfare. The first rebellion had announced itself with all the subtlety of a war horn, giving King Daeron time to gather his forces and march to meet them. This time would be different. This time they would establish a foothold in Westeros before anyone realized what was happening. This time they would gather their supporters in secret, rise simultaneously across the realm, and present the crown with a crisis too large to handle with a single battle. The key to the plan was a tourney at White Walls, a newly built castle in the Riverlands. The castle's lord, Butterwell, was a Blackfyre sympathizer. Not openly, not foolishly, but in his heart he had never forgotten who he had truly supported at Redgrass Field. The tourney would provide cover for gathering lords and knights from across the realm, and during the festivities the conspiracy would reveal itself. Daemon II would be crowned, the lords would declare for him, and by the time word reached King's Landing, it would be too late for Bloodraven to stop them. It was a clever plan. It was a careful plan. It might even have worked, if not for three factors the conspirators had not adequately considered. The first was that Bloodraven's network of informers was far more extensive than they realized. The Hand of the King had spies everywhere, in every castle, in every city, in every harbor, where ships from Essos might land. The man had 1,000 eyes and one, as the saying went, and he knew about the White Walls conspiracy long before the tourney ever began. The second was that Daemon II, for all his training and preparation, was not his father. He lacked the presence, the charisma, the sheer force of personality that had made the first demon a figure men would die for. When the young pretender arrived at White Walls, he inspired respect but not devotion. He was competent but not compelling. And in a realm still healing from one civil war, competence alone was not enough to convince lords to risk their lands and their lives. The third factor was simpler and more immediate. There were still men of honor in Westeros who remembered what the first rebellion had cost, who had no desire to see the realm drown in blood again, who would act to prevent another war, even if it meant betraying their hosts. One such man was Duncan the Tall, called Dunk, a hedge knight in service to a Targaryen prince, Aegon, called Egg, the unlikely grandson of Aegon the Unworthy, who would one day sit the Iron Throne himself. Dunk was not a political creature. He did not understand the intricacies of succession law or the fine points of legitimacy, but he understood right and wrong, and he understood that another rebellion meant another Redgrass Field, meant 20,000 more dead men rotting in fields while their families wept. When the conspiracy at White Walls was exposed, when Bloodraven's men arrived and the careful plans fell apart, Dunk did what simple, honorable men do. He acted. The details are lost to history, the specifics unclear, but what is known is that the Second Blackfyre Rebellion ended before it truly began. Daemon II was forced to flee, racing back to Essos with what remained of his dignity and his dreams. The lords who had gathered at White Walls scattered, some arrested, some pardoned, some executed for their roles in the conspiracy. The Golden Company, which had prepared to land in force and support their chosen king, stood down. Their ships never left the Essosi coast. Their soldiers never set foot on Westerosi soil. Once again, they watched from across the narrow sea as their hopes crumbled into nothing. For Bitter Steel, the failure at White Walls was a bitter reminder that will alone could not overcome poor timing and good intelligence. They had moved too soon without adequate preparation, trusting in stealth when Bloodraven's eyes saw everything. The first rebellion had failed because they announced themselves too openly. The second had failed because they had tried to be too clever, too subtle. The question that haunted him was simple. What approach could possibly succeed? But Bitter Steel was nothing if not stubborn. One failure had sent him into exile. A second failure would not break him. The Golden Company would continue. The cause would continue. And there were still Blackfyres who could claim the throne. The years that followed were difficult ones for the exiles. The failure at White Walls had consequences. In Westeros, Bloodraven's grip tightened even further. Known Blackfyre sympathizers were watched constantly. The great lords who had quietly supported the First Rebellion now found their every move scrutinized, their correspondence intercepted, their household knights questioned. The realm had been reminded that the Blackfyre threat still existed, and Bloodraven was determined to ensure it would never threaten the peace again. In Essos, the Golden Company continued taking contracts, continued building their reputation, continued burying their dead in foreign soil, but morale suffered. The soldiers had believed that 201 IAC would be the year of return. They had prepared for war, sharpened their blades, said their goodbyes to Essosi wives and children, and then nothing had happened. They had stood ready, and the call to sail west had never come. Some began to wonder if it ever would. Bitter Steel crushed such doubts when he found them, but he could not crush them all. Doubt is a disease that spreads through whispers and silence, through the things men do not say but think in the dark hours before dawn. The Golden Company remained disciplined, remained professional, remained true to their contracts, but the dream of return, which had burned so brightly in the early years, began to seem like a distant thing, a story told to children, a promise that would never be kept. And then, as often happens in the Game of Thrones, everything changed. In 221 AC, King Aerys III died without issue. The crown passed not to one of Daeron the Good's descendants, but sideways to Maekar, the fourth son of Aegon the Unworthy's legitimate line. Maekar was a warrior king, respected and feared, but his ascension was not without controversy. There were those who questioned whether the succession had followed the proper line, who whispered that other claimants had better rights, who saw in the transition of power an opportunity for chaos. And Bloodraven, the man who had dominated Westerosi politics for 2 decades, suddenly found his position less secure. King Maekar trusted his own counsel more than his hands. The network of spies and informers that Bloodraven had built so carefully began to fray as new powers rose at court. Bitter Steel saw the opportunity immediately. A new king meant new factions, new allegiances, new uncertainties. The realm was not at peace but in transition, and transitions were always dangerous times for those in power. It was time to try again. The Third Blackfyre Rebellion began in 219 AC, though its exact details have been lost to time, and the deliberate obscurity of failed rebellions. What is known is that it was better planned than the second attempt, more carefully coordinated, with actual military force rather than tourney conspiracies. The Golden Company did land in Westeros this time, their ships carrying soldiers who had trained their entire lives for this moment. But once again, the rebellion failed. The reasons are debated by Meisters, and history remains unclear on the specifics. Some say the Blackfyre forces landed in the wrong location, that the lords they expected to support them had already been arrested or frightened into submission. Others claim that Daemon II proved himself a poor battlefield commander, unable to inspire his troops or outmaneuver his enemies. Still others whisper that treachery played a role, that one of the great conspirators betrayed the cause at the crucial moment. What is certain is that the Golden Company fought, and fought well, but they could not overcome the simple reality that most of Westeros had no desire for. Another civil war. The great lords remembered Redgrass Field. They remembered 20,000 dead. They remembered what rebellion cost, and most of them had decided the price was too high. The Third Blackfyre Rebellion ended with the Golden Company retreating back to Essos, their numbers diminished, their reputation intact but their cause in ruins. Daemon II survived, but his hopes of claiming the throne died in Westerosi mud, just as his fathers had a generation before. 3 times they had tried, 3 times they had failed, and Bitter Steel, now old and scarred and weary beyond measure, was forced to confront a terrible truth. Perhaps they would never succeed. Perhaps the dream of return was exactly that, a dream, and nothing more. But the Golden Company did not forget, and it did not forgive. They had failed 3 times, but they had not broken. Their contracts remained solid. Their reputation remained gold. Their word remained true. And deep in his bitter heart, Bitter Steel knew that the game was not over. There were still Blackfyres. There would be other opportunities. The wheel would turn again, as it always did in Westeros. And when it did, the Golden Company would be ready. They had waited decades already. They could wait decades more. Beneath the gold, the bitter steel remained sharp, and the dream of return, battered, diminished, but unextinguished, endured. The years crawled forward like wounded men across a battlefield, slow and bleeding but relentless. Aegor Rivers, Bitter Steel, the man who had founded the Golden Company on the bitter ashes of defeat at Redgrass Field, finally died in 241 AC at the age of 89. He had lived long enough to see 3 Blackfyre rebellions fail, long enough to watch an entire generation of exiles die in foreign lands, dreaming of a home they would never see again. Long enough to understand that the dream of returns might be exactly that, a dream that would never manifest into reality. But he died, still believing, still hating, still certain that one day somehow the Blackfyres would reclaim what had been taken from them. The Golden Company buried him with full honors in the lands around Myr, where they had won so many contracts and shed so much blood. They gave him a funeral worthy of a king, though he had died a sellsword captain in exile. And then they chose a new commander and continued forward, because that was what the Golden Company did. They endured. They persisted. They never broke. The decades that followed Bitter Steel's death saw the Golden Company continue to dominate the sellsword trade in Essos. Their reputation was unmatched. Their discipline was legendary. Their contract record remained perfect. Not a single agreement broken. Not a single employer betrayed. Other companies might offer lower prices or greater numbers, but when a magister or archon or merchant prince needed absolute certainty that their soldiers would not abandon them at the crucial moment, they hired the Golden Company. The gold flowed in year after year, contract after contract. The company grew wealthy in ways Bitter Steel had never imagined when he first led his ragged band of exiles across the narrow sea. They owned lands in Essos now, had investments in trading ventures, maintained permanent camps that were more like small cities than military encampments, but the dream of return never died. Each new commander of the Golden Company swore the same oaths Bitter Steel had sworn. Each new recruit learned the same songs about Westeros, heard the same stories about the injustice of exile, absorbed the same certainty that they were not merely sellswords, but exiles waiting for their chance to reclaim their birthright. And the Blackfyre line continued. Daemon II had fathered children before his death. Those children had children in turn. The bloodline remained unbroken, carried forward by sons and grandsons who bore the name Blackfyre and the claim to the Iron Throne, even as they grew up knowing nothing of Westeros beyond stories and songs. By the middle of the 3rd century after Aegon's conquest, the current bearer of the Blackfyre name was a man called Malus, and he was nothing like the demons who had come before him. Malus Blackfyre, called Malus the Monstrous, was a giant of a man, hideously malformed, but possessed of terrible strength. He stood near 7 feet tall, his body massive with muscle, his arms thick as tree trunks, but it was his face that earned him his epithet. A second head grew from his neck, a malformed thing that was more suggestion than reality, a twisted lump of flesh with what might have been an eye and what might have been a mouth. The Meisters would say it was a teratoma, a growth of absorbed twin tissue that manifested in grotesque form. The common folk simply called it monstrous and crossed themselves when Malus passed, but monstrous or not, Malus was the last male Blackfyre, the final bearer of a claim that stretched back through 3 generations of pretenders to Daemon I himself. And he was ambitious in ways his predecessors had not been. Where earlier Blackfyres had waited for the Golden Company to arrange their rebellions, had relied on the careful planning of their supporters and the strategic thinking of their commanders, Malus took power for himself. The stories say he killed his cousin, the previous claimant to the Blackfyre name, in single combat, crushing the man's skull with his bare hands to establish his right to lead. Whether this is true or merely legend embroidered by those who loved a dramatic tale, what is certain is that by 260 AC, Malus commanded not just the loyalty of the Golden Company, but genuine fear. Men followed him not out of ideological devotion to the Blackfyre cause, but because Malus was the sort of man who could break you in half if you refused. This change in the nature of Blackfyre leadership coincided with a change in the political landscape of Essos. The free cities, always fractious and competitive, had fallen into one of their periodic spasms of alliance and counter-alliance. Trade disputes had escalated into small wars. Small wars had expanded into larger conflicts. And from this chaos emerged an opportunity that the Blackfyre cause had been waiting for since Bitter Steel first led his men into exile. A coalition formed, calling itself the Band of Nine. It consisted of 9 powerful individuals, merchant princes, exiled lords, sellsword captains, and adventurers, who pooled their resources and armies with a single goal: conquest. Not merely raids or border skirmishes or the petty wars that characterized most Essosi conflicts, but genuine conquest on a scale not seen in generations. They would seize the Stepstones, those rocky islands that control the shipping lanes between Westeros and Essos. They would fortify them, control the trade that flowed through the narrow sea, and use the wealth and strategic position to expand their power in all directions. And once they controlled the Stepstones, once they had proven themselves capable of genuine conquest rather than mere sellsword work, they would turn their eyes west toward Westeros itself. For Malus and the Golden Company, this was the opportunity they had been waiting for, not another conspiracy that would unravel before it began, not another rebellion that would collapse when expected supporters failed to materialize. This would be a war of conquest, backed by genuine military force, with allies who brought their own armies and resources. The Band of Nine could field tens of thousands of soldiers. They had ships, siege equipment, supplies, everything necessary for sustained military operations. Most importantly, they had momentum. They were not asking lords in Westeros to rise in rebellion, with all the risk and uncertainty that entailed. They would establish themselves in the Stepstones first, demonstrate their power, and only then make their move on Westeros when they could do so from a position of strength. The Golden Company joined the Band of Nine eagerly. For the first time in decades, for the first time since the failed rebellions of Daemon II, they would actually fight for the Blackfyre cause rather than simply training and waiting and growing old in exile. The soldiers sharpened their blades with genuine purpose. The officers planned campaigns with real targets rather than hypothetical invasions. The dream of return, which had faded to a background hum in the decades since Bitter Steel's death, roared back to life. The War of the Nine Penny Kings, as it came to be called, began in 260 AC, when the Band of Nine seized several of the Stepstones in a swift and brutal campaign. The islands were lightly defended, their garrisons unprepared for an assault of such scale and ferocity. Within months, the Band of Nine controlled the major islands and began fortifying them, building the infrastructure necessary to control the shipping lanes and project power in all directions. Westeros, embroiled in its own concerns under the rule of King Jaehaerys II, initially paid little attention to events of the Stepstones. Piracy and small-scale conflicts were common in those waters. The idea that this represented a genuine threat to the Seven Kingdoms seemed remote. The Stepstones were valuable strategically, but they were also notoriously difficult to hold. Dozens of would-be conquerors had seized them over the centuries, only to be driven out by storms, disease, or the united opposition of those whose trade they threatened. But the Band of Nine was different. They had the resources for sustained occupation, they had the manpower to garrison the islands properly, and they had Malus Blackfyre, who turned the Stepstones campaign into the first step of a larger plan to invade Westeros itself. The Golden Company formed the professional core of the Band of Nine's military forces. While the coalition included sellswords from a dozen companies and levies from various Essosi cities, it was the Golden Company that provided the discipline, the training, the tactical expertise that turned a mob of soldiers into a genuine army. They held the crucial positions in every battle. They led the assaults on fortified positions. They were the anvil against which enemies broke, the hammer that shattered defensive lines. And they suffered for it. The stepstones were brutal terrain for warfare, rocky islands with little fresh water, limited supplies, and constant storms that could wreck ships and drown armies. Disease was rampant. Supply lines were tenuous. The original inhabitants and the various factions who had interests in the region did not surrender easily. Every island had to be taken through blood and siege. Every fortification had to be stormed. Every village had to be pacified. The Golden Company paid in blood for every mile of rock they conquered. But they never broke contract. They never retreated unless ordered to do so. They fulfilled every obligation the Band of Nine placed upon them exactly as their reputation promised they would. By late 260 AC, the Stepstones were firmly under the Band of Nine's control, and Malus began planning the invasion of Westeros proper. The target was the Stormlands, close to the Stepstones, relatively accessible, and historically a region where Blackfyre's sympathies had run deep during the First Rebellion. If they could establish a foothold there, if they could rally support among the Stormlords, they might finally achieve what 3 generations of Blackfyres had failed to accomplish. But Westeros, finally recognizing the threat, responded with overwhelming force. King Jaehaerys II called his banners. The great lords of the 7 kingdoms, putting aside their own disputes and rivalries, united against the common threat of invasion. An army was assembled unlike anything seen since the Targaryen conquest itself. Tens of thousands of soldiers from every region of Westeros, led by some of the finest commanders in the realm. They sailed for the Stepstones in a fleet that darkened the horizon, and they came not to negotiate or to parley, but to destroy the Band of Nine completely. The battles that followed were among the bloodiest of the century. The Golden Company, outnumbered but superbly trained, held positions that should have been overrun. They conducted fighting retreats that saved armies from complete destruction. They counterattacked when circumstances allowed, inflicting casualties on the Westerosi forces that shocked commanders who had expected to sweep the sellswords aside. But numbers matter, supplies matter, and most of all, unity of purpose matters. The Band of Nine was a coalition of ambitious individuals, each with their own goals and their own ideas about how the war should be fought. As the Westerosi forces pressed harder, as casualties mounted and supplies dwindled, the coalition began to fracture. Some members of the Band of Nine pulled their forces back, unwilling to commit to what increasingly looked like a losing cause. Others attempted to negotiate separate surrenders or truces. The Golden Company, true to their reputation, never broke contract. They fought on, even as their allies abandoned them, even as the situation became increasingly hopeless, even as it became clear that the dream of conquering Westeros was dying once again in blood and mud and futility. The final battle came at the Stepstones' stronghold, where Malus had established his headquarters. The Westerosi forces surrounded the position and began a systematic assault, pushing the defenders back yard by yard, building by building. The Golden Company fought with the desperation of men who understood this might be their last chance, that if they failed here, the Blackfyre cause would die with them. And then, in the chaos of close combat, Malus the Monstrous met his end. The details vary depending on who tells the tale. Some say it was Barristan Selmy, called Barristan the Bold, who struck the killing blow, a young knight of the Kingsguard who had already distinguished himself in the fighting and would go on to become one of the greatest warriors of his age. Others credit different champions. The fog of war and the desire of many men to claim credit for slaying such a fearsome foe have obscured the truth. What is certain is that Malus died in combat, and with his death, the last male line of House Blackfyre ended. The monstrous giant who had crushed his cousin to claim leadership, who had led the Golden Company into the greatest military campaign since the first Blackfyre Rebellion, who had come so close to establishing a foothold in Westeros from which a true invasion could be launched. He died in the Stepstones, his dreams of conquest unfulfilled, his cause defeated once again. The remaining members of the Band of Nine surrendered or fled. The Westerosi forces secured the Stepstones and began the process of dismantling the fortifications the Band of Nine had built. The war was over, and the Blackfyre threat, the danger that had haunted Westeros for more than 60 years, that had sparked 3 rebellions and countless conspiracies, was finally, definitively ended. The male line was broken. The dream was dead. And yet the Golden Company endured. They retreated from the Stepstones in good order, their discipline intact even in defeat. They had suffered terrible casualties, thousands of their soldiers dead, their ranks depleted, their officers killed in the fighting. But the core of the company survived, along with their reputation for never breaking contract, never abandoning their employers, never surrendering until the bitter end. They returned to Essos and began rebuilding, taking contracts as they always had, fulfilling obligations with the same professional excellence that had made them famous. But something fundamental had changed. The cause they had been founded to serve, the restoration of House Blackfyre to the Iron Throne, no longer existed. Malice had been the last male Blackfyre. There might be distant female line descendants somewhere, cousins of cousins who carried a drop of Blackfyre blood, but the direct male lineage that had defined their purpose for 6 decades was extinct. The Golden Company had become an army without a cause, sellswords who had forgotten how to be anything else, exiles who could never truly go home because the dream that had sustained them through 3 generations of failure and blood had finally, irrevocably died in the Stepstones. They had fought for the Blackfyre cause with everything they had. They had given their gold, their blood, their lives, their futures, and in the end, it had amounted to nothing. The Targaryens still ruled in King's Landing. Westeros continued on without them, and the Golden Company remained in Essos, professional and disciplined and utterly without purpose beyond the next contract, the next war, the next payment of gold for services rendered. But for what purpose now? That question would haunt the Golden Company for decades to come, a wound that never quite healed, a dream that refused to die even after the cause that inspired it had been extinguished forever. Or so it seemed. History, as always, had a few more surprises waiting. The game was not quite over, but that realization would come slowly, in the decades after the War of the Ninepenny Kings, as the Golden Company tried to understand what they were now that the Blackfyre dream had finally ended. The decades that followed the War of the Ninepenny Kings were perhaps the strangest in the Golden Company's history. They had been forged in the fires of the first Blackfyre Rebellion, tempered by exile, shaped by the iron will of Agor Rivers, into a weapon with a single purpose: to restore House Blackfyre to the Iron Throne. Every contract they took, every coin they earned, every reputation they built had been in service to that distant goal. They were not merely sellswords, they were exiles waiting to return home. And now the Blackfyre line was extinct. The cause was dead. The dream that had sustained them through 3 generations of failure and blood had finally ended on a rocky island in the Stepstones, crushed beneath the weight of Westerosi steel and the death of Malice the Monstrous. What, then, was the Golden Company? The question haunted their commanders as they rebuilt in the years following 260 AC. They had lost thousands of men in the Stepstones, their ranks depleted by battle, disease, and the simple, brutal arithmetic of warfare against a superior force. Officers who had led companies for decades were dead, their experience and institutional knowledge lost. Younger men stepped into their roles, men who had known nothing but the Golden Company, who had been raised on stories of Westeros, but who increasingly understood that those stories were just that, stories, not plans, not realistic goals, but legends of a past that would never return. And yet the Golden Company continued. That was what they did. They endured. They rebuilt. Within 5 years of the Stepstones, their ranks had been replenished with new recruits, their officer corps reorganized, Their reputation for absolute reliability is intact despite the crushing defeat they had suffered. Magisters and archons across Essos still sought their services, still paid premium prices for the certainty that the Golden Company would never break contract, never betray their employers, never abandon a position until ordered to do so. The gold flowed in, as it always had. The contracts came regularly. They fought in Mir against Tyrosh, in Lys against pirates, in the disputed lands for whichever city paid the most. They won more battles than they lost. They maintained their discipline, their training, their professional excellence. By all objective measures, the Golden Company remained the finest sellsword company in the known world. But something fundamental had changed. The soul had gone out of them, if an army could be said to have a soul. In the early years, in Bitter Steel's time, every contract had been a means to an end. They fought for gold, yes, but the gold was to fund their eventual return to Westeros. They built their reputation not merely for professional pride, but because a fearsome reputation would make lords think twice about opposing them when they finally invaded. They maintained their discipline not just for tactical efficiency, but because they were soldiers of a cause, not mere mercenaries. And discipline was how they proved they were better than those who had defeated them at Redgrass Field. Now they fought for gold, because that was what sellswords did. They maintained their reputation because it brought more contracts. They kept their discipline because it was habit, tradition, the way things had always been done. The purpose behind the actions had evaporated, leaving only the actions themselves. This crisis of identity manifested in subtle ways. The songs around campfires slowly changed. In earlier decades, the songs had been about Westeros, about the great castles and ancient houses, about the injustice of exile, about the day they would return and reclaim what had been stolen. Now the songs were about battles in Essos, about officers who had died with honor, about the pride of the Golden Company itself rather than the cause it had been founded to serve. New recruits still swore the oath. Our word is good as gold. But when they did so, they understood it differently than their predecessors had. For the original exiles, the oath had been about proving themselves worthy of return, about demonstrating that they were better than the usurpers who ruled Westeros. For the new generation, born in Essos to parents who had been born in Essos, the oath was simply professional pride. They would fulfill their contracts because that was what the Golden Company did, not because it served some grander purpose. The officers debated endlessly what the company should become. Some argued for embracing their new reality. They were sellswords, the finest in the world, and there was no shame in that. They should focus on what they did best, fighting wars for those who could afford them, maintaining their reputation, accumulating wealth and power in Essos. Westeros was across the narrow sea, and might as well be on another world for all the relevance it had to their lives. Others insisted that abandoning the dream of return would be a betrayal of everything Bitter Steel had built, everything the Golden Company had stood for since its founding. They might have lost the Blackfyre cause, but they were still exiles, still Westerosi in their hearts, still men who belonged across the narrow sea, even if they could never return there. To give up on that identity would be to become just another sellsword company, indistinguishable from the Second Sons or the Windblown or any of the other mercenary bands that cluttered Essos. The debate was never truly resolved. The Golden Company continued forward in a state of uncertain identity, maintaining their traditions and their discipline, while no longer quite believing in the purpose those traditions had been designed to serve. But traditions, once established, are difficult to break. The Golden Company continued to recruit preferentially from Westerosi exiles and their descendants. They continued to maintain their camps with a quasi-nobility, with officer positions often passing from father to son in imitation of hereditary lordship. They continued to keep detailed records of which families among them had been lords in Westeros, which had been knights, which had been small folk, as if such distinctions still mattered in Essos, where a sellsword was a sellsword regardless of what his grandfather had been. They even continued to maintain a command position called the Captain General, though the title had lost much of its original meaning. In Bitter Steel's time, the Captain General had been not just the military commander, but the leader of the Blackfyre cause, the man responsible for preparing and executing the eventual return to Westeros. Now the Captain General was simply the head of a very successful mercenary company, distinguished from other sellsword captains only by the size of his army and the perfection of his contract record. The contracts themselves became increasingly routine. The Golden Company fought in the disputed lands, that eternal war zone between Myr, Lys, and Tyrosh, where the borders shifted with every generation, and soldiers could make an entire career without ever achieving anything permanent. They fought for one free city against another, then switched sides when contracts expired and the gold was better elsewhere. They put down pirate nests in the stepstones. Bitter irony, fighting to secure the same islands where Malus had died and the Blackfyre dream had been extinguished. They were good at what they did, very good. When the Golden Company took the field, battles were usually won quickly and decisively. Their discipline was such that they could execute complex maneuvers that would have confused less professional forces. Their training was superior to almost any army they faced. Their officers had studied the great battles of history and could recognize tactical situations and respond appropriately. They won far more often than they lost, and even their losses were typically orderly retreats rather than routs. But it all felt hollow somehow. They were fighting wars that meant nothing to them, for causes they did not believe in service to employers they often despised. The gold was good, the work was steady, but there was no passion in it, no sense that what they did mattered beyond the immediate tactical objectives of any given contract. Some men left, not many. The Golden Company paid better than most alternatives and offered more security, but a steady trickle of soldiers decided they would rather try their fortunes elsewhere, find some cause they could actually believe in, or simply settle down in Essos and stop pretending they were anything other than mercenaries fighting for coin. The officers let them go with little complaint. Men who did not want to be in the Golden Company were unlikely to maintain the discipline and commitment that made the company great. Others stayed, but grew cynical. They fulfilled their contracts because that was what they were paid to do, but they stopped believing it meant anything beyond the gold. They trained because training was required, but they no longer took pride in being better than other sellswords. They swore the oath, but the words were empty ritual rather than genuine commitment. These men were often the most dangerous, not because they would break contracts. The Golden Company's culture was too strong for that, but because cynicism is contagious, and it spread through the ranks like a slow poison. But there were also those who clung to something deeper, who insisted that being part of the Golden Company still meant something even if the Blackfyre cause was dead. These men maintained the traditions with genuine devotion. They taught new recruits not just how to fight, but why the Golden Company was different from other sellswords. They kept the histories alive, telling stories of Redgrass Field and Bitter Steel, and the 3 failed rebellions not as fairy tales, but as cautionary lessons about the cost of defeat and the importance of never surrendering, never breaking, never giving up, regardless of the odds. It was this faction, these traditionalists who refused to let the company become just another band of mercenaries, who kept the soul of the Golden Company alive even when its purpose had died. They might not have a Blackfyre to serve anymore, but they still had their reputation, their discipline, their oath. And perhaps they whispered in private moments, perhaps someday there would be another cause worth fighting for, another chance to be something more than sellswords, another opportunity to return to Westeros not as exiles seeking to reclaim lost honors, but as something else, something new. The question of what that something might be remained unanswered. Westeros continued on without them, barely aware that the Golden Company existed. The great lords of the 7 kingdoms had their own concerns. Succession crises, rebellions, the endless Game of Thrones that consumed the realm's attention. The defeat of the Band of Nine had been so complete, the extinction of House Blackfyre so definitive that most Westerosi considered the matter closed. The Golden Company was a historical curiosity, a footnote in the story of the Blackfyre rebellions, no longer a genuine threat to anyone. This suited the Golden Company's commanders in some ways. Being forgotten meant being left alone. They could rebuild, retrain, accumulate wealth and resources without interference from Westeros. No spies from the Iron Throne watched their camps. No assassins targeted their officers. They were simply sellswords, doing what sellswords did, earning honest gold through honest steel, but it also stung. They had been founded to matter, to be significant, to reclaim thrones and restore houses. Being reduced to irrelevance, being forgotten by the very realm they had spent generations trying to reclaim, was perhaps a worse fate than open hostility would have been. At least when Westeros had feared them, when Bloodraven had sent spies to watch them and armies to defeat them, it had meant they mattered. Now they were nothing. Just another sellsword company in Essos, distinguished only by their reputation for reliability. The decades passed slowly. The 260s became the 270s. Officers aged out and were replaced by younger men. Soldiers who had fought at the Stepstones died of old age or in subsequent contracts. The institutional memory of the Blackfyre cause faded further with each passing year. New recruits knew the history intellectually, but they did not feel it in their bones the way the original exiles had. Westeros was an abstract concept, not a home they remembered or longed for, and yet the traditions persisted. The oath was still sworn. The contracts were still honored. The discipline was still maintained. The Golden Company remained, in all the ways that mattered, the same organization Bittersteel had founded, professional, reliable, deadly. They were just no longer certain why those qualities mattered beyond the immediate practical benefits they provided. It was during this period of drift, this time of prosperity without purpose, that whispers began to reach the Golden Company from Westeros. Whispers that would, in time, give them a new cause to believe in, a new reason to dream of return. The whispers spoke of a prince across the narrow sea, a Targaryen in exile, a young man who claimed to be the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, and who was gathering support among the free cities. His name was Viserys, and he carried with him his younger sister, a girl called Daenerys. And though the Golden Company did not know it yet, though the whispers were still faint and uncertain, these children represented something the company had not seen in decades. Possibility, not the old cause. House. Blackfyre was extinct, that dream was dead and buried. But a new cause, a different dream. The restoration of House Targaryen, the very house they had been founded to oppose. The irony was not lost on anyone, but irony, the officers reflected, was better than meaninglessness. Anything was better than continuing as they had been, wealthy and professional and utterly without purpose. For now, though, these were just whispers, rumors, distant possibilities. The Golden Company continued taking contracts, continued fighting wars that meant nothing to them, continued burying their dead in foreign soil. They were sellswords without a cause, exiles who had forgotten what they were in exile from, soldiers waiting for orders that might never come, but they were waiting. That was what the Golden Company did best. They waited with discipline and patience and the absolute certainty that eventually, somehow, their time would come again. They had waited for decades already. They could wait decades more. The sword was still sharp. The oath was still honored. And deep in the hearts of those who remembered what the company had once meant, who refused to let it become merely another band of mercenaries, the dream of return, battered, transformed, but never quite extinguished, quietly endured. The year was 283 AC, and the world had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Robert Baratheon sat the Iron Throne, his warhammer having crushed the skull of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen at the Trident, and shattered 3 centuries of Targaryen rule in a single blow. The dragon banners had been torn down from the Red Keep. The Targaryen dynasty, which had seemed as eternal as the wall itself, had fallen in less than a year of brutal civil war. King Aerys II, the Mad King, had been slain by his own Kingsguard. His children were dead or scattered. The great houses that had supported the dragons for generations had bent the knee to the Baratheon stag. In Essos, in the camps and taverns where the Golden Company gathered, the news was received with complicated emotions. On one hand, these were exiles who had been founded specifically to oppose House Targaryen, to restore House Blackfyre, which had been the Targaryens' greatest rival. The fall of the dragons should have been cause for celebration, vindication of everything Bittersteel had believed, that the Targaryens were usurpers, that their rule was illegitimate, that eventually justice would prevail. On the other hand, House Blackfyre was extinct. The cause the Golden Company had been founded to serve was dead and buried, and watching another house successfully overthrow the Targaryens, watching Robert Baratheon accomplish what 3 generations of Blackfyres had failed to achieve, was salt in wounds that had never quite healed. They had fought for decades to reclaim the Iron Throne for their chosen kings. Robert had done it in less than a year, but there were other complications, other implications that would take time to fully understand. 2 Targaryen children had survived the fall of their house. Viserys and Daenerys, the last living children of Aerys the Mad, had been spirited away to Dragonstone and then across the narrow sea to safety in Essos. They were children, helpless and hunted, but they carried royal blood. They were the last of their line, the final remnants of a dynasty that had ruled Westeros since Aegon the Conqueror first landed with his dragons. And they needed protection. They needed supporters. They needed an army. The Golden Company, professional as always, watched these developments with interest, but no immediate action. Exiled Targaryens were not their concern. The company had contracts to fulfill, wars to fight, gold to earn. The fall of one royal house and the rise of another in distant Westeros meant little to sellswords in Essos beyond its potential to disrupt trade and create new conflicts they might be hired to resolve. But there were men in Essos who saw opportunity where others saw only chaos. Men who understood that the Game of Thrones never truly ends, that every new regime creates its own enemies, that the children of dethroned kings always represent the possibility of restoration. Men who thought in terms of decades and generations, who could play the long game because they had nothing but time. 2 such men were Varys and Illyrio Mopatis. Varys, the spider, the master of whispers who had served as Aerys' spy master, and then smoothly transitioned to serving Robert, was a eunuch of uncertain origins who commanded networks of informants throughout both Westeros and Essos. His motivations were opaque, his true loyalties unknown even to those who thought they knew him best. He had served the Mad King but had made no effort to save him. He served Robert Baratheon but showed no particular devotion to the Baratheon cause. He was a creature of secrets and whispers, moving through the world like smoke, impossible to grasp or understand. Illyrio Mopatis was different, but no less dangerous, a magister of Pentos, enormously wealthy from a lifetime of shrewd trading and careful investments. He presented himself as a merchant prince, interested only in profit and comfort. His manse in Pentos was legendary for its luxury. His feasts were spoken of across the free cities. He seemed the very picture of a man who had found success in commerce, and wanted nothing more than to enjoy the fruits of his labors. But beneath the silk and the smiles, Illyrio Mopatis was a player of the great game, a man who thought in terms of thrones and dynasties and the reshaping of the world. And sometime in the years following Robert's rebellion, Illyrio and Varys had formed a partnership, a conspiracy that would span decades and reshape the political landscape of both Westeros and Essos. Their goal, simply stated, was to restore House Targaryen to the Iron Throne. Not because they loved the Targaryens particularly, not because they believed in the divine right of dragon kings, but because they had a plan, a careful scheme that required a Targaryen on the throne for reasons that would only become clear in time. The plan, in its original form, centered on Viserys Targaryen. The boy, for he was still a boy when his house fell, would be raised in exile, educated in kingship, prepared for the day when he would return to Westeros and reclaim his father's throne. He would marry Daenerys to Khal Drogo, a powerful Dothraki warlord, securing an army of savage horsemen to sweep across the narrow sea. Meanwhile, Varys would work from within Robert's regime, sowing discord, weakening the Baratheon hold on power, ensuring that when Viserys returned, the realm would be ready to embrace him. Or so the plan went in those early years. But Varys and Illyrio were nothing if not adaptable. They understood that plans made in one decade might need to change in the next, that the Game of Thrones rewarded flexibility more than rigid adherence to any single strategy. And as they watched Viserys grow from boy to man, as they observed his personality developing, they began to have doubts about whether he was truly suited to be the king they needed. Viserys was bitter, angry, obsessed with reclaiming his birthright, but lacking any real understanding of how to rule once he had reclaimed it. He had been a child when his house fell, had grown up in exile hearing only that he was the rightful king, that Westeros had been stolen from him, that everyone who opposed him was a traitor and a usurper. This had not produced a wise or measured ruler. It had produced an entitled, paranoid young man who saw enemies everywhere and understood nothing of the careful political work necessary to actually govern a kingdom. The Golden Company had been founded by men not unlike Viserys, exiles obsessed with reclaiming what they believed was rightfully theirs, unable to move past the injustice of their defeat. Bitter Steel had channeled that bitterness into something productive, into building an organization that endured for generations. But Bitter Steel had been a hard man, a practical man, a man who understood that will alone could not overcome reality. Viserys had none of those qualities. He was his father's son, proud, unstable, and increasingly mad. So Varys and Illyrio adjusted their plans. They would keep Viserys as a backup, as a public face for the Targaryen restoration, but they would need something else, someone else, if their plan was to succeed. They needed a Targaryen who could actually rule, who could inspire loyalty rather than fear, who could unite Westeros rather than tear it apart. And so they turned to a secret they had been keeping, a boy they had been raising in secret, a child who represented everything their plan needed and more. They called him Aegon, the sixth of his name, and they claimed he was the son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and Elia Martell. According to the story Illyrio and Varys told, the boy who had been killed during the sack of King's Landing, the infant whose head had been smashed against a wall by Sir Gregor Clegane while Tywin Lannister looked on, had been a peasant child, a substitute. The real Aegon had been spirited away by Varys in the chaos, taken to Essos, and raised in secret to one day reclaim his birthright. It was a compelling story. It was also quite possibly a lie. The truth of Aegon's parentage is one of the great mysteries of the age, and maesters and scholars debate it still. Some accept the story at face value, that he truly is Rhaegar's son, the heir to the Targaryen dynasty, the prince who was promised. Others are more skeptical. They point out that Varys and Illyrio have lied about many things, that their entire conspiracy is built on deception and misdirection, that claiming this boy as a Targaryen serves their purposes, whether it is true or not. And there are those who whisper an even darker possibility, that Aegon is not a Targaryen at all, but a Blackfyre, a descendant of the female line of that extinct house, raised and trained to pose as a Targaryen in order to finally, after more than a century, achieve what Daemon and his sons never could, claim the Iron Throne through deception where force had failed. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial but intriguing. Illyrio Mopatis had been married to a woman named Sarah, a Lysene beauty who died years before the main events of this tale. Some whisper that Sarah was descended from the Blackfyre line, that she carried the blood of exiled kings in her veins. If Aegon is Illyrio's son by Sarah, he would have Blackfyre blood, making him a perfect candidate for the role Varys and Illyrio had designed. A pretender with a claim just legitimate enough to be believed, backed by the wealth and resources necessary to make that claim stick. The Golden Company would eventually learn of this boy, this Aegon, and they would have to decide whether to believe the story. But that decision lay in the future. For now, in the years following Robert's rebellion, the company continued as it had for decades, taking contracts, fighting wars, maintaining their reputation as the finest sellswords in Essos. But Varys and Illyrio had not forgotten about the Golden Company. How could they? An army of exiles founded to oppose the Targaryens, now adrift without purpose or cause, they were the perfect tool for a Targaryen restoration. if they could be convinced to switch sides, if their hatred of the dragons could be transformed into support for a new Dragon King, it would require careful work. The Golden Company's identity was bound up in opposition to the Targaryens. Their founding myth was the Blackfyre rebellions. Their greatest heroes were men who had died fighting against the Red Dragon. Asking them to support a Targaryen restoration would be asking them to betray everything their company had stood for since its founding. Unless, of course, the Targaryen they were being asked to support was not really a Targaryen at all. Unless the boy calling himself Aegon was actually the last Blackfyre, the culmination of everything Bittersteel had dreamed of. A Blackfyre on the Iron Throne, wearing Targaryen colors as camouflage, achieving through deception what could never be achieved through force of arms. That was the genius of Varys and Illyrio's plan, if the Blackfyre theory is true. They had found a way to give the Golden Company everything they wanted, a return to Westeros, a chance to reclaim honor and lands, a cause worth fighting for, while technically supporting the restoration of the very house the company had been founded to oppose. It was a plan built on layers of deception, on strategic ambiguity, on telling different truths to different people. The approach to the Golden Company was made carefully, through intermediaries and subtle feelers rather than direct offers. Varys and Illyrio needed to gauge the company's receptiveness before revealing too much. They needed to understand how the company's leadership thought, what they valued, what it would take to bring them into the conspiracy. What they found was encouraging. The Golden Company, for all its professional success, was still fundamentally adrift. They had money, reputation, and military prowess, but they lacked purpose. The contracts they took were increasingly routine, the wars they fought increasingly meaningless. The officers longed for something more, some cause that would give meaning to their existence beyond the accumulation of gold. More importantly, a new generation of leadership had risen within. The Golden Company, men who had not fought at the Stepstones, who knew the Blackfyre cause only as history rather than lived experience. These men were pragmatic rather than ideological. They understood that House Blackfyre was extinct, that the old dream was dead. But they also understood that the Golden Company needed a purpose, and that a Targaryen restoration, particularly one that would allow them to return to Westeros, to reclaim lands and titles to finally go home, was as good a purpose as any. One man in particular became crucial to Varys and Illyrio's plans, Jon Connington, called Griff, a lord of the Stormlands, who had been exiled after failing to capture Robert Baratheon during the rebellion. Connington had loved Rhaegar Targaryen with a devotion that went beyond mere loyalty. When Rhaegar died at the Trident, something had broken in Connington. He had wandered Essos for years, drinking himself toward death, until Varys and Illyrio found him and gave him a new purpose, raising Aegon, Rhaegar's son, preparing the boy to reclaim his father's throne. Connington brought something to the conspiracy that neither Varys or Illyrio could provide: genuine passion. He believed in Aegon, believed with religious fervor that this boy was Rhaegar's son and the rightful king of Westeros. His devotion was absolute, unquestioning, the kind of loyalty that could inspire others, and crucially, Connington had connections to the Golden Company, knew their officers, understood their culture and their needs. Through Connington, Varys and Illyrio began building bridges to the Golden Company, planting seeds of possibility, hinting at opportunities that might arise if the company was willing to think beyond their traditional rivalry with the House Targaryen. They spoke of lands waiting to be claimed in Westeros, of titles waiting to be restored, of the chance to finally return home, not as exiles begging for forgiveness, but as conquerors claiming their due. And slowly, carefully, they introduced the idea that had always been central to their plan, that the Golden Company should support Aegon Targaryen's claim to the Iron Throne. The initial reactions were mixed. Some officers rejected the idea immediately. They were the Golden Company, founded to oppose the Targaryens, and supporting a dragon restoration was a betrayal of everything they stood for. Others were more pragmatic. House Blackfyre was extinct. The old cause was dead. And if supporting a Targaryen was what it took to finally return to Westeros, Then perhaps old rivalries needed to be set aside. And there were those who heard whispers, who suspected or were told outright that Aegon might not be what he claimed, that beneath the Targaryen name beat a Blackfyre heart. For these men, supporting Aegon was not a betrayal, but the culmination of everything the Golden Company had always fought for. They would put a Blackfyre on the Iron Throne at last, even if he wore Targaryen colors to do it. The debates within the Golden Company's leadership were intense and often bitter. They were being asked to fundamentally redefine what their company meant, to abandon or transform the founding mythology that had sustained them for more than a century. It was not a decision to be made lightly, but ultimately, pragmatism won. The Golden Company agreed to support Aegon Targaryen's claim to the Iron Throne, to provide him with the army and the expertise necessary to invade Westeros and reclaim the throne. In return, they would finally go home. They would reclaim their lands and titles. They would cease being exiles and become lords of Westeros once more. It was everything they had ever wanted, wrapped in the banner of everything they had been founded to oppose. The irony was not lost on anyone, but after more than a century of exile, after 3 failed rebellions and 1 disastrous war, the Golden Company had learned that victory mattered more than ideology, that going home mattered more than ancient grudges, that a throne claimed was worth more than a throne dreamed of. They would support a Targaryen, or a Blackfyre wearing Targaryen colors, because doing so gave them their best chance of finally achieving what Bittersteel had promised on the day he led them into exile: a return to Westeros, a restoration of their honor, a final vindication of all the blood and gold, and years they had spent waiting for their moment. The decision was made. The pact was sealed. And in making that decision, the Golden Company committed itself to the most audacious gamble in its history. They would break their contract with Meyer, an unprecedented act for a company that had never, in more than a century, broken a single agreement. They would stake everything on Aegon's claim, on Varys and Illyrio's conspiracy, on the possibility that, after all these years, the moment had finally come. At last, after more than a century, the Golden Company would sail for home. But the Westeros they remembered existed only in songs and fading memories, and the dragons they had agreed to support, or pretend to support, were more complicated than anyone quite understood. The game was far from over. In many ways, it was only just beginning. The year was 300 AC, and the realm of Westeros was tearing itself apart. 5 kings claimed dominion over the 7 kingdoms, each with armies at their backs and ambitions that stretched beyond their ability to fulfill them. In the north, Robb Stark had been crowned king in the north after his father's execution in King's Landing. In the Iron Islands, Balon Greyjoy declared himself king of the Isles and the north, launching raids along the coastline and seizing territories, while the mainlanders were distracted by their own conflicts. In the Stormlands, Renly Baratheon gathered the might of the Reach and declared himself king, his claim based on might rather than right. In Dragonstone, his older brother Stannis ground his teeth and insisted he was the true king, by every law of succession, even as most of the realm ignored him. And in King's Landing, the boy king Joffrey Baratheon sat the Iron Throne, a crown on his golden head, and madness in his blood, ruling in name, while others pulled the strings. The War of the 5 Kings, as it would come to be called, had set the realm ablaze. Armies marched across the riverlands, leaving devastation in their wake. The small folk suffered as they always did when lords played their games. Their crops burned, their villages sacked, their sons conscripted to die in battles they did not understand for causes they did not care about. The great houses maneuvered for advantage, forming and breaking alliances with dizzying speed, each convinced that they alone understood how to win the Game of Thrones. It was, in short, exactly the kind of chaos that Varys and Illyrio had been waiting for. A realm divided against itself, exhausted by war, led by weak or foolish kings. This was the perfect moment for a Targaryen restoration, or at least that was what they had believed. But plans made in secret often founder when confronted with reality. The conspiracy that Varys and Illyrio had spent years building, the careful cultivation of Aegon Targaryen as the perfect king, the patient gathering of resources and allies, all of it was supposed to culminate in a coordinated invasion that would sweep aside the fractured kingdoms and restore the dragons to power. Instead, everything went wrong. Viserys Targaryen, the bitter prince who had been meant to serve as the public face of the Restoration, died in the Dothraki Sea, his head crowned with molten gold by Khal Drogo in response to his arrogance and threats. The Dothraki army that was supposed to cross the narrow sea and terrify Westeros into submission never materialized. Khal Drogo himself died of infection, his khalasar fragmenting in the traditional Dothraki succession struggles. But from that disaster came something unexpected, something that neither Varys nor Illyrio nor anyone else had anticipated. Daenerys Targaryen, the child bride who was supposed to be a passive tool in someone else's game, walked into a funeral pyre and emerged with 3 living dragons. For the first time in more than a century and a half, dragons lived in the world, and they belonged not to Aegon, the carefully prepared prince, but to Daenerys, the girl no one had thought to plan around. Jon Connington, watching these developments from Essos while he raised and trained Aegon, understood immediately what this meant. The plan was falling apart. Daenerys was supposed to be irrelevant, a supporting character in Aegon's story. Instead, she had become the story, the Dragon Queen, the mother of dragons, a figure of legend reborn. If they waited for her to join them, if they tried to incorporate her into their plans, Aegon would be reduced to a footnote in her tale. Everything they had worked for would be subsumed into her narrative. Connington made a decision that would define everything that followed. They would not wait. They would not coordinate with Daenerys or try to merge their forces. They would invade Westeros now, while the realm was weak and divided, while the War of the 5 Kings had exhausted everyone's armies and depleted everyone's resources. They would establish Aegon on the Iron Throne before Daenerys even returned from the east, presenting her with a fait accompli, a Targaryen already ruling, a restoration already accomplished. She could join them or oppose them, but either way, Aegon would not be secondary to her legend. The Golden Company, when presented with this plan, faced a moment of decision as significant as any in their history. They had agreed to support Aegon's claim, yes, but this was asking them to commit fully, to stake everything on an immediate invasion with no guarantees of success. It meant breaking their contract with Myr, the first time in more than a century that the Golden Company would fail to fulfill an agreement. It meant gambling their reputation, their very identity as a company whose word was good as gold, on the chance that Aegon could actually win the throne. The debate among the officers was intense. Some argued for caution, for waiting until conditions were more favorable, for coordinating with Daenerys and her dragons rather than racing to preempt her. The company had survived for more than a century by being professional, by fulfilling contracts, by never taking unnecessary risks. Breaking contract with Myr to invade a war-torn kingdom with uncertain support was the opposite of everything they had always been. But others, led by Connington and the company's Captain General Harry Strickland, argued that this was the moment they had been waiting for since bitter steel first led them into exile. Westeros would never be weaker. The throne would never be more vulnerable. If they waited for perfect conditions, they would wait forever. The Golden Company had been founded to reclaim the Iron Throne for the Blackfyre line. Now they had a chance, perhaps their last chance, to put a king on that throne who carried Blackfyre blood, even if he wore Targaryen colors. History would not give them another opportunity like this. The decision, when it came, was to proceed. The Golden Company broke their contract with Myr, absorbed the reputational damage that came with it, and prepared for the invasion they had been dreaming of for more than 100 years. They would sail for Westeros. They would land in the Stormlands, where memories of the Targaryen dynasty ran deep and where Robert Baratheon's legacy was more complicated than simple loyalty. They would establish a foothold, rally support, and then march on King's Landing to claim the throne. It was a bold plan. It was a desperate plan. But after more than a century of waiting, the Golden Company was finally, truly going home. The fleet that carried the Golden Company across the narrow sea was impressive by any standard. 10,000 soldiers, trained and equipped to a standard that few armies in Westeros could match. Siege equipment, supply trains, everything necessary for sustained military operations. Officers who had studied the geography and politics of Westeros their entire lives, who knew which lords might be convinced to support them and which would have to be defeated or bypassed. And at the head of it all, Aegon Targaryen, the young prince who was either Rhaegar's son or the last Blackfyre, depending on which story you believed, trained since childhood to reclaim a throne he had never sat. They landed in the Stormlands near Griffin's Roost, Jon Connington's ancestral seat, and immediately began the work of conquest. The initial phase went better than anyone had dared hope. Griffin's Roost fell quickly, its garrison unprepared for an assault of such scale and professionalism. Connington reclaimed his ancestral home and raised Aegon's banner, the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen, from its towers. Other castles followed. The Golden Company moved through the southern Stormlands with practiced efficiency, taking keeps and fortifications that had been left undermanned while their lords marched away to fight in the War of the Five Kings. They were methodical, professional, and devastatingly effective. Within weeks, they controlled a significant portion of the Stormlands coast and had established supply lines back to Essos. The soldiers of the Golden Company, many of whom had never seen Westeros before, found themselves walking through a land their fathers and grandfathers had described in stories. These were the castles they had heard about in songs. These were the hills and rivers and forests that had lived in their imaginations their entire lives. For men who had been raised to think of themselves as exiles, as Westerosi in blood, even if Essosi in birth, actually setting foot in the land of their ancestors was overwhelming. Some wept. Others simply stood in silence, unable to process the reality of finally being home. But sentiment could not change the strategic situation they faced. The Stormlands were not rising to support them the way they had hoped. Some minor houses declared for Aegon, yes, drawn by the chance to be on the winning side of a Targaryen restoration, or simply opportunistic enough to recognize that the Golden Company was the most competent military force currently operating in the region. But the great houses of the Stormlands, the ones whose support would actually matter, remained cautious or actively hostile. Part of the problem was timing. The Stormlands had already been ravaged by the War of the Five Kings. Renly Baratheon had raised his armies here before marching north. Stannis Baratheon had tried to rally support here before moving to the Wall. The region was exhausted, its manpower depleted, its lords wary of committing to yet another pretender with grand promises. They had seen too many kings rise and fall in the past few years to be impressed by one more claimant, even one backed by the legendary Golden Company. Another problem was legitimacy. Aegon claimed to be Rhaegar's son, yes, but who could verify that? He had been an infant when supposedly killed during the sack of King's Landing. Anyone could claim to be that lost prince. Without proof, without dragons like Daenerys possessed, without some sign that the gods themselves endorsed his claim, he was just another young man with an army demanding that people accept his story and risk their lives for his cause. And there was the fundamental issue that Westeros had changed in the years since Robert's rebellion. The generation that remembered the Targaryens with fondness or loyalty was aging or dead. The younger generation had grown up under Baratheon rule, had been taught that the Mad King was a monster and Robert a hero, had no particular attachment to the Dragon Dynasty. For them, a Targaryen restoration was not a return to rightful order, but a foreign invasion by a pretender backed by sellswords. The Golden Company adapted their strategy to these realities. If the Stormlands would not rise en masse to support them, they would secure what territory they could, establish a defensible position, and wait. The War of the Five Kings was still raging in the rest of Westeros. Sooner or later, one side or another would emerge victorious, but that victor would be exhausted, their armies depleted, their resources strained. That would be the moment to strike, when they could present themselves not as foreign invaders, but as a solution to Westeros' chaos, as the restoration of the old order that would bring peace after years of war. In the meantime, they fortified their position. They took Storm's End itself through a combination of siegecraft and negotiation, the great castle that had withstood everything from Targaryen dragons to years-long sieges, during Robert's rebellion finally falling to the Golden Company's professional approach. It was a significant victory, both strategically and symbolically. Storm's End was one of the great castles of Westeros, seat of House Baratheon, a fortress that commanded the approaches to both the Reach and the Crownlands. Holding it gave the Golden Company legitimacy and defensive depth. Aegon established his court at Storm's End, and the work of building a government began. This was the part of conquest that most sellsword companies never considered, that taking castles was only the beginning, that actually ruling required administration, justice, tax collection, all the mundane work of governance that no one wrote songs about. But the Golden Company had officers who had been trained in such matters, exiled lords who remembered how proper lordship worked, men who understood that they were not just conquerors, but would-be rulers. They dispensed justice fairly, more fairly than many of the previous lords had done. They kept their soldiers disciplined, preventing the kind of rapine and pillage that usually accompanied military occupation. They began rebuilding infrastructure that had been damaged in the war, repairing roads and bridges, ensuring that trade could flow again. They wanted the small folk to see that Aegon's rule would be better than what had come before, that the Targaryen restoration meant peace and prosperity rather than more chaos and bloodshed. It was good governance, but it was also a gamble. Every day they spent consolidating their hold on the Stormlands was a day that gave their enemies time to respond, to gather forces, to prepare defenses. Every week of playing Lord rather than Conqueror was a week that allowed the rest of Westeros to wake up to the threat they represented and organize against them. And organize they would. The Golden Company might hold the southern Stormlands and Storm's End itself, but King's Landing still stood, and whoever eventually emerged victorious from the War of the Five Kings would have to deal with a foreign army that had landed in the south, claiming the throne. The Golden Company was a temporary problem that the Westerosi lords could afford to ignore while they fought each other, but sooner or later, the attention of the entire realm would turn south, and then the real test would begin. For the soldiers of the Golden Company, the waiting was agonizing. They had finally returned to Westeros after more than a century of exile. They had taken castles, reclaimed lands, even achieved their initial objectives with remarkable success. But the great victory, the moment when Aegon would march on King's Landing and claim the Iron Throne, remained frustratingly distant. They were home, but they were also stuck, unable to advance until the strategic situation shifted in their favor. Some officers argued for more aggressive action, for marching on King's Landing immediately, while the Lannisters were distracted by other threats. Others counseled patience, arguing that premature action would unite Westeros against them, while patience would allow their enemies to exhaust each other. The debates continued, the days turned into weeks, and still they waited at Storm's End, an army in limbo, having achieved the dream of return, but not yet the dream of restoration. Jon Connington, dying slowly from grayscale contracted during the journey west, felt time slipping away from him. He had dedicated his life to raising Aegon, to preparing the boy to reclaim his father's throne. He had brought the Golden Company across the narrow sea, had taken Storm's End, had done everything right. But the throne itself remained out of reach, and Connington could feel his disease progressing, could feel his time running out. He drove the planning sessions with increasing urgency, knowing that he might not live to see Aegon crowned, but determined to set in motion the events that would make it possible. They had returned. They had proven themselves. They had shown that the dream of restoration was not mere fantasy, but achievable reality. The Golden Company held Westerosi soil for the first time since the War of the Ninepenny Kings, and this time they intended to keep it. They had finally come home, even if home barely noticed, even if the realm they had returned to was too consumed by its own conflicts to properly recognize the significance of their return. But notice or not, ready or not, the Golden Company was here to stay. They had waited more than a century for this moment. They had endured exile, 3 failed rebellions, the extinction of House Blackfyre, decades of meaningless contracts and purposeless warfare. They had suffered and bled and died in foreign lands, always dreaming of this return. Now that they were here, now that they held Storm's End and the southern Stormlands, now that Aegon Targaryen's banner flew from Westerosi towers, they would not give up. They could not give up. The wheel had turned. The exiles had returned. And in the great Game of Thrones, a new player had entered the field, one with a century of accumulated grievances, professional military excellence, and the absolute determination to see their mission through to the end. The endgame approached, though none could say how it would resolve, but the Golden Company had made their move, and Westeros would have to respond. After more than 100 years of waiting, of dreaming, of preparing, the moment had finally come. They were home, and they intended to stay. The Golden Company sits at Storm's End in the year 300 AC, an army of 10,000 exiles who have finally returned home after more than a century of wandering. They hold one of the great castles of Westeros. They have a prince at their head who claims to be Rhaegar Targaryen's son, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. They have achieved, in material terms, more than 3 generations of Blackfyre pretenders ever managed to accomplish. And yet the question that haunts them, the question that has always haunted them, remains unanswered. What will it all amount to in the end? To understand the Golden Company's significance, to grasp what they truly represent in the story of Westeros, one must look beyond the battles they have fought and the contracts they have fulfilled. One must examine what they mean as an idea, as a symbol, as a cautionary tale about the dangerous persistence of dreams and the terrible cost of refusing to let go of the past. The Golden Company was founded by men who had lost everything, their lands, their titles, their king, their very place in the world, and who refused to accept that loss as final. Aegor Rivers looked at the defeat at Redgrass Field and decided that it was not an ending, but a setback, that the cause could continue in exile, that one day they would return and reclaim what had been taken from them. It was a decision born of pride, of rage, of an absolute unwillingness to bend or break or accept the judgment that history had rendered against them. And for more than a century, that decision has shaped the lives of thousands of men. Sons have grown up dreaming of a homeland they have never seen because their fathers dreamed of it. Grandsons have died in Essos, fighting for gold to fund a restoration that never came because their grandfathers swore oaths they could not break. Generation after generation, the Golden Company has perpetuated itself, has maintained its identity as exiles rather than simply accepting that they are Essosi now, that their lives are in the free cities, that Westeros is a place they left behind and will never truly reclaim. There is something admirable in that persistence, in that absolute refusal to surrender. The Golden Company's discipline, their professional excellence, their perfect contract record, all of these things flow from the same stubborn determination that Bitter Steel embodied. They have succeeded in Essos because they refused to fail, because failure would mean admitting that the exile was permanent, that the dream was dead, that everything they had sacrificed had been for nothing. But there is also something tragic, something almost pathetic in their story. They have spent 100 years preparing for a return that may never truly succeed, may never give them what they actually want. They have buried thousands of men in foreign soil, men who died dreaming of home but never seeing it. They have accumulated gold and reputation and power, but it has all been in service to a cause that was already lost at Redgrass Field, that was always going to be lost because the world had moved on, and they had not. The 3 Blackfyre rebellions were not noble attempts at justice. They were the convulsions of men who could not accept that they had lost, who insisted on dragging the realm back into war because their pride could not bear the alternative. 20,000 men died at Redgrass Field, fighting over which branch of a royal family deserved a throne. How many more died in the subsequent rebellions? How many small folk saw their villages burned, their crops destroyed, their sons conscripted to die in battles they did not understand? And for what? so that one group of silver-haired princes could replace another group of silver-haired princes on an uncomfortable metal chair? The Golden Company story is the story of that cost, of the human price paid when powerful men refused to let go of grievances and ambitions. Every soldier who died fulfilling a contract in Essos instead of living a peaceful life with a family was a victim of bitter steel's pride. Every child raised to dream of returning to a homeland that did not want them was a victim of the company's inability to accept reality. Every coin spent preparing for an invasion that kept failing was a coin that could have been used to build something permanent and meaningful in Essos instead. And now, finally returned to Westeros, what have they found? A realm that barely remembers them, that sees them not as exiled lords returning home, but as foreign sellswords invading for their own profit. The great houses they thought would rally to their cause have remained cautious or hostile. The small folk they imagined would welcome them as liberators see them as just another army bringing more war and suffering. The throne they have sacrificed everything to reclaim sits in King's Landing, held by their enemies, as far out of reach now as it was when they fled across the narrow sea 100 years ago. But perhaps that is not the whole story. Perhaps there is something more complex happening here, something that resists easy moral judgments. The Golden Company, for all their flaws, represents something that Westeros often lacks: institutional memory, long-term thinking, the ability to plan in terms of generations rather than immediate advantage. The great houses of Westeros play the game of thrones for short-term gains, for immediate power and wealth. They betray each other, break oaths, shift allegiances with every change in fortune. The Golden Company has maintained its core identity and purpose for more than a century. There is something impressive in that, something that speaks to a kind of loyalty and commitment that the backstabbing lords of Westeros might learn from. Moreover, the Golden Company's professional excellence, their discipline and training and tactical skill, represents a different model of military organization than the feudal levies that dominate Westerosi warfare. They are soldiers by choice and profession, not peasants dragged from their fields to die for lords they have never met. They are paid fairly, treated with a measure of respect, and given opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth. In some ways, the Golden Company represents a more modern, more rational approach to warfare than the medieval system that still dominates Westeros. And there is the question of Aegon himself, the young prince the Golden Company has returned to support. If he truly is Rhaegar's son, then the Golden Company is serving the rightful heir to the throne, helping to restore the legitimate dynasty after years of Baratheon usurpation. Even if he is not, even if he is a Blackfyre pretender, or simply some boy Varys and Illyrio found and trained for the role, he might still make a better king than the alternatives. He has been raised specifically to rule, educated in history and law and governance, trained to think of kingship as a responsibility rather than a prize. That is more than can be said for Joffrey or Tommen, or most of the other claimants in the War of the Five Kings. So perhaps the Golden Company's century of waiting, their refusal to give up on the dream of return, was not entirely foolish. Perhaps they were right to maintain their identity, to preserve their purpose, to wait for the moment when Westeros would be weak enough and circumstances favorable enough for one last attempt at restoration. Perhaps, in the end, their stubbornness will be vindicated, or perhaps not. The truth is that the Golden Company's story is not yet finished. They sit at Storm's End, waiting to see how the game will play out, whether Aegon will march on King's Landing, or whether events will overtake them before they can make their move. The great houses of Westeros are slowly becoming aware of the threat they represent. Daenerys Targaryen continues her journey westward with 3 dragons at her back, and when she arrives, the Golden Company will have to decide whether to support her, oppose her, or somehow reconcile her claim with Aegon's. The political situation remains fluid, the military balance uncertain, the outcome unclear. But whatever happens, whether Aegon claims the throne or dies trying, whether the Golden Company wins glory or suffers another devastating defeat, their story will stand as one of the strangest and most telling in the history of Westeros. They are an army built on nostalgia and grievance, on the refusal to accept defeat, on dreams that have outlived their dreamers. They are exiles who spent a century waiting to go home, only to discover that home had changed so much in their absence that they no longer fit there. They are soldiers whose word is good as gold, but whose cause has always been questionable at best. They are, in the end, a cautionary tale about the seductive power of lost causes and the human capacity for self-deception. The Golden Company convinced themselves that they were special, that they were different from other sellswords, that their exile was temporary and their return inevitable. They built an entire identity around that belief, passed it down through generations, made it the core of everything they were. And they may have been right. They may yet return triumphant, may yet see Egan crowned and their lands restored, but they may also have wasted 100 years chasing a dream that was never achievable, sacrificing present happiness for a future that would never arrive. Some readers and scholars believe that Aegon will indeed claim the throne, that the Golden Company's long wait will be vindicated, that they will finally achieve the restoration they have sought for so long. These optimists point to Aegon's training, to the tactical brilliance of the Golden Company, to the chaos consuming Westeros, and the vacuum of legitimate authority waiting to be filled. They argue that Aegon represents the best hope for stability and good governance, that his victory would be not just the Golden Company's triumph, but Westeros' salvation. Others are more skeptical. They note that every previous attempt at restoration has failed, that the pattern is clear. The Golden Company dreams, plans, invades, and then is defeated by the harsh reality of Westerosi politics and military power. They point out that Aegon's claim is dubious, his support limited, his enemies numerous and powerful. They predict that the Golden Company's return will end like all their previous attempts. It is of blood and defeat and another generation of exile, if any of them survive. And there are those who whisper the darkest possibility of all, that even if Aegon wins, even if he claims the throne and the Golden Company finally achieves its century-long goal, it will not bring them what they actually want, because what they want is not really the Iron Throne or political power, or restored lands and titles. What they want is to go back to Redgrass Field and win that battle, to undo the defeat that started their exile, to reclaim not just their position but their innocence, their certainty that they were right and just and deserving. And that, no matter how many thrones they claim or kingdoms they conquer, is something they can never have. The past is gone. The men who fought at Redgrass Field are dead. The world has moved on, and no amount of military success can bring it back. The Golden Company's legacy, then, is complicated. They are warriors of legendary skill and discipline. They are also men trapped by their own mythology, unable to move forward because they are always looking backward. They are exiles who have finally come home. They are also foreigners who will never truly belong. They are the fulfillment of Bittersteel's dream. They are also proof of its fundamental futility. In the great tapestry of Westerosi history, the Golden Company will occupy a unique place. They are the army that never gave up, that maintained its purpose across 4 generations of soldiers, that finally returned to accomplish what should have been impossible. They are also a warning about the cost of obsession, about the danger of letting dreams define reality, about the tragedy of men who sacrificed their lives for causes that were lost before they were born. Beneath the gold, the reputation, the success, the wealth, the professional excellence, lies the bitter steel of Aegor River's hatred and grief and refusal to accept defeat. That bitter steel has shaped the Golden Company, has made them what they are, has driven them to achievements that no other sellsword company has matched, but it has also warped them, trapped them, prevented them from ever finding peace, or contentment or acceptance of the world as it actually is, rather than as they wish it to be. And now, at Storm's End, with Aegon Targaryen's banner flying from its towers, and a century of waiting finally come to its conclusion, the Golden Company faces its final test. Will they prove that stubbornness and discipline and absolute commitment to a cause can overcome any obstacle? Or will they prove that some dreams are meant to remain dreams, that the past cannot be reclaimed no matter how much blood and gold you spend trying? The answer like so much else in the story of ice and fire, remains unwritten. The Golden Company's tale has not yet reached its end, but whether that ending brings triumph or tragedy, vindication or final defeat, their story will stand as one of the most remarkable in the long, bloody history of the struggle for the Iron Throne. If you see the Golden Company's century-long quest differently after walking through their complete history, you are not alone. Their story raises questions that have no easy answers. Questions about loyalty and obsession, about the weight of history and the cost of dreams, about what we owe to the past and what we owe to the future. Share your thoughts and your own theories in the comments below. Do you believe Aegon is truly Rhaegar's son, or is he the last Blackfyre, the culmination of Bittersteel's plan? Will the Golden Company finally achieve the restoration they have sought for so long, or are they doomed to repeat the pattern of failed rebellions? And if they do succeed, will victory give them what they actually want, or will they discover that home is not a place you can return to, but something that exists only in memory? If you would like more deep dives into the hidden corners of Westeros and Essos, into the stories of houses and armies and rebellions that have shaped the world of ice and fire, subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the rich, complex, and endlessly fascinating history that George R.R. Martin has created. The Golden Company's story may be unique in its particulars, but the themes it embodies, exile and return, dream and reality, persistence and futility, echo through every page of A Song of Ice and Fire. The exiled army that never gave up has finally come home. Now we wait to see whether home was worth the century they spent trying to reclaim it.